Thank you again for coming. I thought about this. I've been thinking about doing something like this for a long time, and when the theme of the gaps was decided, I jumped at the opportunity. It's not very often that a medievalist get to talk about contemporary things, so I had to do it, right? And I'm super happy to see that the gaps Symposium is continuing and that it's having continued support from the Dean Suite. Area studies are under pressure politically, administratively, academically. But I think this is also a great opportunity to move away from that narrative of the area studies being on the defense, moving away from what some might call the postmodern skepticism against sort of universal structures towards a more optimistic search for cross-cultural meanings, epistemologies, in what some might call meta-modernism. And I promise that is my last BS word that I'm going to say. There's a need for renewed efforts to fill the gaps from postmodernism. Yeah, I'm a dad, I have to do this. And I think we need to fill those gaps through conversations and building conceptual bridges between regions. One of those gaps, I think, is communication. We are, in academia, we are prone to maybe talk to our colleagues more than we are prone to talk with our colleagues. Very few opportunities to actually have conversations like we're having today, so that is one of the reasons why I really relish this opportunity. Therefore, we're also taking a different approach with our panel today. We're not going to read up from manuscripts. Maybe it's a protest in its own right, I guess. We're seeing this as exploratory more than explanatory, a stepping stone maybe towards new alliances, new networks, finding new ways of communicating across regions, across temporal divides, having a medievalist talking with modernists. And today I'm going to keep my own comments very, very short because I have three fabulous people on the panel that I'd much rather listen to. But I'm also taking this time just to take the opportunity, I guess, to take a first step at what I provisionally call semiotics of protest. That is analyzing how expressions and symbols are employed and understood, not just by the user who employs those signs, but also by the receiver of those messages. Without all three, so the sign, the user, and the audience, there would in fact be no protest. I would also argue that maybe protests are sign systems. Maybe they're nothing but sign systems. And doing this, having that kind of approach, I think, is my own little feeble medievalist's attempt to bridge linguistics, social sciences, and culture and historical studies, which is, I think, is exactly what this school is all about. So with this conversation that we will have today, I hope to show how questions arising from pre-modern studies, can trigger wider conversations with broader applications. So, I'm not going to talk about medieval peasants, but I'm going to mention them, of course. You don't put me here without me saying something about medieval peasants. And medieval peasants, Japanese peasants, that I'm doing research on, they were as poor as peasants get, but they were very skillful at manipulating languages and metaphors created by the elites. And they were manipulating them for their own protest purposes. Highly scripted and public tax evasions, running away, hiding taxes, so on and so on and so on. something that my predecessor as a professor in medieval Japanese history here at IU, Thomas Kierstead, has called theaters of protest. I don't know what it is about Bloomington that makes medieval Japanese scholars do this, but here we are. In my own research, I flipped the script of banditry, bandit accusations that South Asian subaltern studies scholars have also done for their region. Long story short, what I discovered was that they were typically not about destroying the system. These protests were not destroying the system. They were working within the system. And they were doing it in such a way that they would manipulate these languages of the elites in such a way that the elites had no other option than to accept that language because it was their own. And this protest system probably also prevented large-scale rebellions in Japan. We do not see large rebellions in Japan until the 15th century, when that system, that social system, and that conflict system had been destroyed and collapsed and gave way to a new semiotic system, violence. It is this manipulation of signs and sign systems that triggered my interest in this question and why I suggested this panel and reached out to my dear colleagues here, who all agreed graciously to be part of this conversation. And I'm super excited about this. I just want to briefly introduce all three panelists, and then we will hear how you have thought about these bigger questions about languages and signs and protests. And yes?
Introduce yourself.
Do I have to introduce myself?
Didn't. Oh, you okay. Didn't.
I didn't even introduce myself?
You didn't even mention your name.
Okay, so I was that young-looking guy there with the glasses.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that screen.
I'm an associate professor in Japanese history here, yeah, enough about that. Now we have Assert Al-Saleh, associate professor and department chair of the Middle Eastern languages and cultures at IU. He's doing research on modern Arabic literature and culture, the author of Voices of the Arab Spring, and something that is very close to what we are doing today, historical dictionary of the Syrian Revolution and Civil War. Fantastic. He has even done a comparative study of the Tale of Heike and Chaucer's Knight's Tale. And I'm like, I freaked out when I saw that. And I thought, we have to have a whole separate panel on that stuff. Next up, we have Negar Pato, senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Middle East. She's also the director of Mira Consultancy, thus bringing in an entrepreneurial spirit in our panel, I think. Formerly, she was a senior lecturer at Massey University, New Zealand. She's doing research on religion, politics, and security issues in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and explores how these conflicts affect security in multicultural democracies as well as in authoritarian regimes. And last, we have Gardner Bowington, associate professor in Central Asian Studies and International Studies. My brother in arms of having discussions about area studies and the plight of said area studies. He's doing research on modern Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, ethnic conflicts. Author of the book, The Uyghurs, Strangers in Their Own Land. And he shares with me a strong interest in the future and the state of area studies. With that, I'd like to hear what everyone has to say, and let's start with you, Assert.
Thank you so much, Martin. I appreciate it. Arigato. And I appreciate the support from the Hamilton Lugar leadership for organizing this symposium. Obviously, many thanks to the audience, students, faculty, staff for making Friday afternoon such a lively and intellectually stimulating forum. My research, before I talk about my research, I have to start that as an intellectual or academic, I started with language. I thought when I was learning Arabic in Syria, this is the only thing that I can master. Beyond language, I felt I have no domains to train myself, not in sciences, maybe not in deeply philosophical disciplines. So I had this existential fear that beyond language, maybe I can be only useless. And then when I came to the United States, I started as a TA for Arabic. After establishing an Arabic club in a small town, small college in Kansas, Emporia State University in Kansas, I just established an Arabic club, moving from learning Arabic, mastering Arabic in Syria, to basically learn another language, and that was English. So when I started the Arabic club, the university thought, that's interesting. Why don't we adopt Arabic as a language to be instructed for the entire community? And I felt, oh, okay, so your passion for something can lead to establishing maybe cultural as well as linguistic affiliation. So I felt, I never mentioned that in my CV or maybe in any statement, but I feel this is one of the most pride moments that I have as a career, moving to the stage of being a scholar. So after learning English with Arabic there, I felt maybe I need to do something about Arabic literature. And then I start obviously doing my dissertation on something related to Arabic literature. Then the Arab Spring happened. And I felt I need to do something about the Arab Spring. But I am not a social scientist. I'm not a political scientist. And then I just realized I can look at the way language is used and the narratives, just the mere narrative of testimonial retelling of what happened during the Arab Spring. And the language used, the signs of resistance, the sign system that was adopted by Arab masses from Egypt to Libya, Yemen, Syria, all of these countries borrowed basically the same slogans. So the act of sloganeering became very visible, and I was intrigued by that linguistic demonstration of connectivity between Arab masses. And I start following those signs, talking to people who are contributing to that conversation, political as well as social, but also deeply rooted in language. And I became interested in seeing how Arabs use slogans, and they traveled from one place to the other. One of the famous slogans during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is the revolutionary movements that started in 2010, late in December, in Tunisia, moved to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. The most important slogan used was the people, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The people want the demolishing of the regime. This is taken from an Arabic poem, famous Tunisian poet who wrote a famous line, if people ever wanted freedom, if people ever wanted life, which is representative of freedom, fate must answer their call. If people ever wanted life, freedom, fate must answer their call. Very impactful line. The people in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, all adopted the same slogan, rooted in medieval language, refined, not a slogan taken from the vernacular, but actually taken from the elitist classical Arabic language used in his poem. The act that started to have the talk of the town in the entire world, the revolution in Egypt or Tunisia, had a one word that summarized what people wanted. Irhal, which means depart, leave, directed immediately to the dictator, whether it's Tunisian, Egyptian, Libyan, Yemeni, or Syrian. One of the things that this word implies is death, because in Arabic, the word irhal, it means leave, but if you have left, you are the one who had either departed, in English means the departed, the dead person, or the one who just left, one place moved to the other. The Arab masses wanted this kind of death sentence against dictatorial regimes. Irhal, that's why the Egyptians said, to elaborate, they said, Irhal yani imshi yalli ma btifhamshi. Irhal, they said, means depart. Don't you understand? They said that to the Egyptian dictator who is now dead. By coincidence, I guess. He died naturally. One of the things that the grammar of revolt was used unanimously by Arab masses is that the dictatorial regimes, they use their own sign language to emphasize power. So in Syria, for example, we used to live with slogans every single day. In the morning, we say slogans as school kids. One of the famous slogans we use repeatedly every day, even more if we have another event, with blood and souls, we sacrifice you, President. Very powerful. Another slogan, Syria, God, the President, and that's enough. We just say those things are the most important thing in the world. So you can see the indoctrination, the ideology being embedded in the kids' minds as they were growing up in Syria. All this was thrown away when they adopted a different language. The people want to topple the regime, and also the word irhal, leave, depart. The language also used to recognize the fallen heroes of the protest. So people start using Facebook with pictures of those who died during the demonstrations. And they didn't just put those pictures and like asking for more revolts. They said, we are all this guy. We are all this guy. They said that, and they did that in Syria, Egypt, Libya. Libyans were associating themselves with an infamous prison called Selim prison, where Gaddafi killed his opponents or let them die there. In Egypt, there was a famous face of the revolt named Khalid Said. He was killed due to police brutality. They have police brutality in Egypt. It's not only a US thing, unfortunately. So people all said in Egypt, we are all Khalid Said. We are all this person. If it happened to him, it might happen to us. And that was really very powerful as a sign, saying, okay, we need to do something. We need to go out and protest. In Syria, a child, 13-year-old, named Hamza al-Khatib, was also killed because he was participating in the demonstrations. And Syrians also said, we are all Hamza Khatib. They unified the protest. So language became, as Unair said, unifying, bonding, but for the sake of protest. And I need to stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start with give you two images to think about. And one was a woman standing in the doorway and cut a lock of her hair, and just 20 seconds of following this lock of hair. There is no words about it, but in the context of woman life, freedom revolution, it passed through languages, borders, and geographies. So the second image that I would like you to think about is a funeral procedure with a woman carrying the picture of her son during in the streets, and all the neighbors joining him. There's no voice, there's no chanting, there is no uprising or loud exclamation of or a statement, but that also goes beyond the ordinary, and it passes geography. So everybody can have an understanding of what was happening in those images. So these are the movements and the moments that I study. So this chapter of the book that I am writing, and I would like to hear your feedback and your difficult questions, is actually about these moments, is that how can we express and how can we protest and how can we resist when we are living under a totalitarian state which is not accepting you talking. And that was how I started thinking about this. And I started thinking about it as an artwork. So those of you who have read Walter Benjamin know that it's all about the reproduction of the artwork that makes it very accessible and publicly valuable. Now, one of the things that I wanted to think about in this is to think about these signs of protest as an artwork. So if you think about it, your palette would be, for Iranian woman, would be their hair and their body. So everything happens when the law is drawn on your body in the line of your scarf and your clothes. That's where your fight starts. So wherever, if you don't wear your scarf properly, if you choose a different color, if you are colorful, any signs, it's a huge expression, public expression of resistance. And that's how it started. So in the last 2-3 years particularly, with a different campaign. So the first campaign was White Wednesdays, and all women who did not agree with the compulsory veiling, they wore white hijab. And that means that you come to the streets, nobody can arrest you for wearing a white scarf, but that gives momentum, it gives empowerment, it allows you to see that, that there are other people who are a part of you. So the palette, if you think about it as an artwork, the palette they used was the color they used, the way that they wore their hijab, the way that the color of their hijab was chosen on a specific time. And now, with removing their hijab. So any symbols that they used was about spreading this knowledge that you should resist, but you should also preserve your life. So they didn't want to risk their life to become bare in front of a totalitarian state that has guns and unlimited violence. But if you have a palette, then you also need some form of framing, like any artwork. And for them, this framing was the space. From the moment that the totalitarian states capture a place, it doesn't matter where it is or which country, one thing that they do is that they claim public spaces. So you might be able to oppose a totalitarian state in a whisper, in your friend's office, in your own household, but it's the public space that is their focus. And it was important for them to regain this public space. So by bringing those signs, those color, those white scarves, those not wearing a scarf, what they did is that they reclaimed the space that the authoritarian states kind of captured. And by doing that, they reconstructed and deconstructed, deconstructed and reconstructed the concepts that the states want you to think about. So one of the things that authoritarian states do is that they change the meaning of the world. So for example, the word freedom has a completely different meaning. It means dictatorship, but we sell it to everyone, to the public, as freedom. So for example, in the case of Iran, it is a chastity or protecting somebody's chastity could equate to a man beating somebody to death on the streets of Tehran. And that was okay, because that means protection. So the meaning of protection is now changed into violence, but the public is accepting it because it comes from the place of legitimacy and ideological position that many of the citizens at the time the revolutions happens or authoritarian states come to power agree. So one of the things that they did by reclaiming the space and by getting the space back was to deconstruct all those, to reconstruct the meaning of freedom, the meaning of ownership, the meaning of public space and private space, to change the blur and to change the boundaries that the states spent many, many years putting money, investment, ideological propaganda. I mean, we have heard all about these things just even an hour during the last hour. By doing that, they wanted to reclaim it. And that means that this became the frame of this artwork that we are talking about. But also for doing that, we also need a brush stroke. So I thought about the language that was used, and not often, like in the case of Assad, which is very interesting, in the loud voice of protest to say that go and leave it, but in the language of sometimes silence. So, for example, because women are not allowed to sing in Iran, so now we have a young woman having virtual concert that nobody goes to, but they do have a virtual concert in deserted areas in the middle of desert because they want to show the atrocities and the violence, and they want to deconstruct those spaces and reconstruct them around. So you might be able to do that sometimes with silence, sometimes with an act of dancing in the streets for a couple of minutes, sometimes for actually doing something that the others don't do, for example, having a campaign of motorcycle riders because women are not allowed to ride motorcycles. Don't ask me why. But they're not allowed to ride motorcycles. So what we do is that we do have a campaign. That's okay. But what do we do is that we all wear pink helmet on. So not to show, and we don't say anything, we don't carry any signs, but we all wear pink helmet on just to make sure that this is how it goes. So this is the artwork. This is the basic tenets of the artworks that I think they need, and I have studied, and I see as a pattern comes up, whether it is partly organic, partly thought of, and I think it's a combination of both. But the other two characteristics that this artwork needs in order to be able to be distributed and be understood in the public is two things. One is that it should be copyable. So it should be something that is accessible, that everybody has in hand, and doesn't need and require a specific places or a specific tools. So if you have to wear a scarf as a woman in Iran, you all probably have white scarf. So it is very easy to wear your white scarf on Wednesday. So they make sure that whatever they wanted to do was very, very copyable. So everybody could do it, and because of that, you see the numbers, you see others doing what you're doing, it gives you confidence, it gives you the idea that you are not the only one, because that's what the totalitarian states tell you, is that you are the only one. Oh, there are just a bunch of university students who don't like us. There are a bunch of this and there are a bunch of... So they never actually tell you that there are millions of you. But when you do that, that gives you the number, it gives you the confidence, it allows you to, empowers you. And the other thing that I noticed they did is that, yeah, sure. The other thing, and this is my last point, that did is that they changed it from having somebody singing a very loud soprano to a chorus. And they believe that a chorus has more power than somebody is screaming, because you're never going to win that. And this is a lesson that they learn through the 47 years of resisting a totalitarian state. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
So I believe in clean metaphors, but I'm just going to have to say that Nagar and I spoke before this presentation, and I realized that her presentation on art and mine on something else that isn't art are like two adjacent strings on a stringed instrument vibrating in unison, right? Nice clean metaphor. So Nagar started with two vivid images. I'd like to just start with one. I wrote some notes, but there's nothing on here, because I want to talk about blank page protests. Instances in which people feel that the only way they can express themselves is by holding up a blank sheet of paper. I'd like to point out that this is a collaborative project with my friend and colleague Jess Storinaj, who's sitting in the audience. And as we've been listening to fellow panelists, we've been nodding at each other, almost giggling, because the resonances are so strong, right? It is often a critique of area studies that the problem with people who do it is that it encourages years of language study, years of cultural depth that produces kind of obscure scholarship that is not understandable to others and doesn't start conversations. Keep in mind that a specialist on medieval Japan from Denmark, who took inspiration from South Asian subaltern studies and French and British linguistics and semiotics, introduced this panel to us, right? When I hold this up, it doesn't matter what language you know. It doesn't matter where you live. You don't need to know anything. This is kind of funny, right? And it's funny if you're in a place where you don't have to do this, and it's sad if you're in a place where this is really all you can do, okay? So one of the virtues of this panel is you're hearing about various instances of signification, the use of signs to do various kinds of work, to build community, to express important, subtle, sometimes political, sometimes other kinds of thought. We've also thought a lot about authoritarian spaces. Medieval Japan was not friendly to protesters, right? Elite protesters had to commit harakiri, seppuku, after protesting if they were too vigorous in their protest. In these other cases, there could be real costs to protesting in public. The blank page protests we've observed around the world, I'm going to talk about several cases very briefly because the questions have been so good, I want to leave time for that, share one obvious feature. If I hold up a blank page, I'm saying I'm protesting. I'm not telling you what. And I'm also saying that I can't protest. I'm protesting the fact that I can't protest. Okay? So this is something we can all understand across cases. We don't need area studies to do this, right? We just all think, oh yes, I'm in an authoritarian space, this is the only way I can protest. And like a white scarf, right? Like a line from a poem produced in one place that reaches across to other places, right? Becomes inspiring in that way. The blank page is readable across cases. But you do need area studies to understand in each case what isn't being written here and in what language it isn't being written, okay? So between us, we've studied a case from Hungary where the fehér folt, the white stain, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, has been an ostentatiously held up placard, a political billboard, an empty page on a newspaper and so forth, indicating a certain kind of protest. In the case of Russia, certainly after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there have been brave protesters who initially protested with words, found that that was not acceptable. So then people started showing up with kind of hints. One of my favorites is a man who held up a card with 3 stars and then 5 stars. And those of you who know Russian understood that, and the authorities understood it said, "Нет войне," no to the war. He went to jail. After him, a brave woman just held up a blank piece of paper. She was arrested for threatening state security with her blank piece of paper, okay? In another case, in China in 2022, in the wake of the extremely repressive COVID policies, the so-called 零清政策, the zero COVID policies, people were kept in their homes, in their places of work in some cases. They were not allowed to move around. It was very, very hard on families. It was very hard on workers. It was a very difficult situation. People had to find stratagems for getting food in, for taking care of each other, and so forth. The protests against the policy in COVID and also against an entirely avoidable and horrible episode in Urumqi when people in a building predominantly inhabited by Uyghurs, died in a fire because the fence around the building, part of these policies, prevented them from getting out and the fire brigades from getting in, right? So this is a wordless protest. I will point out that some of the protesters, having held up their white pieces of paper in China, then taped them onto a sign that said 自由. It was part of a Chinese slogan. This means freedom. So they just put their blank pages on a huge set of Chinese characters that said freedom. This was quite eloquent. They did another fun thing I will mention for those of you who know Chinese. They shouted slogans like 香蕉皮 and 虾台. Okay? And those of you who know Chinese know that the first one is the very political slogan of banana peel, and the second one is shrimp moss, which makes no sense at all. The first started with similar letters to Xi Jinping, and the second, xia tai, shrimp moss, if you change tones, becomes xia tai, which means step down. Very clever, okay? So that's not blank, but it has some of the characteristics of blankness. And then the last case, I used to work in the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan, Xinjiang. I now predominantly work in Kazakhstan. And there was a notorious episode when a brave young man showed up in a public square with a friend to video him. And he said, I'm going to show you something because I don't want my country to turn into North Korea. Okay? And on film, he held up a white placard and he said, I'm doing this to demonstrate that you can't protest in Kazakhstan. There were two groups of men on either side of him the camera captured. On one side, some uniformed police officers, not knowing what to do. On the other side, some people in suits. The people in suits started doing that thing you all know, getting instructions, turning around to look away from the camera. The instructions they got were from the higher administration. They were secret police. And then they instructed the other folks who were traffic police. If you know Kazakhstan, you know they're the most hated police in Kazakhstan, to go and arrest this guy. And he said, I'm being arrested for holding up a blank white placard, right? And as he got into the car, they said, write something on the board and see how you do then. Right? This is an amazing episode, and what's particularly striking about this episode is if he had simply held up his blank page in public and they had done nothing. If the folks with the earpieces had said, yeah, this is nothing. If the traffic police had said, I'm not arresting someone with a blank piece of paper, it wouldn't have worked. In a certain sense, the police indicted themselves and the administration by arresting the guy who held up the white piece of paper and told them what they were going to do about it. Okay? So this is a fascinating set of instances that we're trying to bring together in terms of both the commonality of situations where authoritarian regimes will not tolerate any kind of protest, including blank protests that say, I can't protest, and the specific circumstances that make them meaningful to populations so that, like those white scarves, they propagate an understanding among people who gather together about the meaning of these events and how to respond to them. Thanks.
I feel like I'd rather hear from the audience than having you answer my questions. I just want like one thing, right? And that's like something that's come up like with all your fabulous comments here is this almost utilization of the ridiculous, right, to protest. Absolutely. Right? That it becomes so absurd, right? Something we also saw with the Portland frog, right? Where you can hardly like arrest a guy in an inflatable frog costume, and then that becomes sort of the whole symbol of the protest. And I'm kind of wondering if how do people learn this, right? So one thing is like, okay, we are seeing memes, we are seeing TikToks with the Portland frog. So now we know, right? But how do people in more repressive under more repressive regimes learn? Because if they don't learn or decode the sign, how do they share it so that it becomes a unifying sign? I don't know if any...
Learning a language, as most of you know, doesn't need necessarily cognitive abilities that are monitored by your brain. It comes naturally. I know it's inside the brain, but the same that we learn a language, any language by exposure, by imitation, by certain acts that will enforce the skills that we have. I saw peasants, bakery people, professors, judges in the Arab Spring using the same memes, the same signs, and it's just because the spontaneous nature of language, you're just exposed to it, and then you become immersed in it, and you don't need to really do such a kind of cognitive processing so that you will learn. It becomes natural. This is my take on that.
I think now, well, we have social media, so now it's very different. But I think even before that, in the case of Iran, there would be a very strict rule of hijab, and then the people who disagreed with the rule tried to change it in a way that it was an innate opposition to that oppression. But that innate opposition to that oppression gave another person the idea that, oh, this is possible. So I can put a little bit of my hair out, and that is not for my hair to be out. That is for me being a part of this movement or this identity. So I think from what my understanding is that we create these sub-identities that work together, and we kind of, in the chorus, I mean, we were talking about our presentations, but I think it's very much the same, is that you kind of innately want to expose yourself in a way, and then the other one learns from you and innately. But now most of these are done over 2 hours with social media, maybe even less.
Yeah.
I'd like to recommend a brilliant short article by a guy named Timur Kuran that came at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's called Now Out of Never. And it's a piece in which he points out that authoritarian regimes succeed in part by concealing from citizens that others feel as they do. When they are cowed into not speaking out, not protesting, not showing up on the street, they have no idea how many people feel as they do and how deeply. And when people begin to show up on the streets, that tells people. And when they start to see a whole sea of white scarves, they realize a lot of people, and that gains a momentum of its own, right? So there's a really important component that is of people just showing up. The other thing I would say, there have been references to performance at several points. Lots of scholars of social movements point out that there are repertoires of protest, right? In the same way that actors have repertoires. And over time, they learn from examples elsewhere. And what's really amazing about blank page protests is these clearly skipped over national borders in various places around the world. So it can have a demonstration effect. People can pick it up from social media, from hearing about it. I heard about the protests in Kazakhstan before I saw the footage of it and so forth, right? But people learn to imitate each other, and this can be a really important part of the process. So,
very cool. Thank you. All right, I think we will open up for some questions from the audience.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. A lot of you brought this up, but you've talked about the role of social media in sort of diffusing ideas, especially across international boundaries. And with the recent wave of the so-called Gen Z protests, which have arisen in Indonesia, Nepal, and elsewhere, there's been a symbol of, for example, the Jolly Roger flag being utilized as a symbol of resistance. And I was just wondering on your about your thoughts as to why this takes place. Like, why are people so enticed by the idea to use something like a flag to send their message, and what the implications of this are? Because as you've brought up, social media plays a very profound role in allowing people to take up these sort of ideas and to unify very quickly. Thank you.
Would you like to start?
I'm a boomer, don't look at me.
I kind of think that I think we are getting better. This is me speaking for the generation after me. So that's how you become an academic. But But I think we are learning to sift through. Some people kind of do a meme, and in Bangladesh it happened. They did a meme, and then the meme became very, very popular, had no meaning. So it's kind of like about, but I think we are getting better, or at least what I see is that people are getting better in organizing. So if you see a movement that has an organization behind it, you will see more coordinated efforts and more coordinated memes, more coordinated structures. But sometimes these events or resistances, they just explode. And you don't have that much control about what messages. And we had that in our generations. We had that with posters. Yes, you would have different posters, and sometimes you would look and didn't know what that poster was about. But so it becomes very difficult. But I think that eventually people pick up and kind of side with that. What the implication is that I'm always an optimist, so I think it is always good for us to know what's happening. What we need to do is to keep on working on critical thinking, understanding facts from fiction, and kind of be able to sift through all of these informations that we received and get bombarded by. But that's my response.
And just one word, these things are not only happening because of social media.
No.
The French Revolution, 1789, made people aware of freedom. And then you have Haiti and the Dominican Republic having their independence and basically removing slavery a few years later. Mm-hmm. Then in Germany, Hegel was appointed as a professor of philosophy, and I'm quoting to, there's something about the spirit of the revolution, something associated with that. I wrote that in a draft for my paper on slogans. And basically he captured the spirit of the time by saying that freedom doesn't come without self-sacrifice. You have to move away from just your self-consciousness being naturally there. You have to do something beyond that. It's basically saying if some people might die for the sake of freedom, then it became this theme where you die for your freedom. Basically, you die for your recognition. And he used the slave-master dichotomy where you cannot break out of the bondage without sacrificing yourself, endangering yourself. Then you get recognition, and you become, in his language, a master.
And I'll also say this whole question, so even if I post something on TikTok, for example, it's not going to create a protest movement, right? Because nobody's going to watch it. So I think it requires a lot of tries, right? A lot of trial and error to find the right message, right? And some of that is dangerous in many areas, right? I'm not just speaking about medieval peasants here, but it can be very. It's a dangerous territory to move into, right? How much of the hair do you let out, right, before it becomes a problem, right? How many strands of hair are we talking here? And so there's a lot of subtleties that participants need to decipher, or need to decode by anticipation of the brutality of the regime or the indifference of the regime, navigating that space, right? And I think that is, if anyone is like studying protests, right? I think that territory, I think is a very fascinating place to look into things, and also for activists, learn languages, right? Because you learn some skills there.
Thank you all. This is a fascinating conversation. One thing that I was very interested in, especially in the first three case examples, was the role of, for protesters, of identifying, legitimating norms or narratives that they can use to constrain the people who would otherwise oppress them. And I did a project years ago on protests in Southeast Asia, looking at, among other things, Vietnamese protesters in Hanoi who organized around Hon Kiem Lake to protest Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And the reason they did that is they said this is the one thing the government can't possibly repress, because it is so central to their legitimating narrative that if they clear us off the streets, they will be seen as violating a core tenet of their own rationale for governing us. And I'd love to hear a little bit I know in the first three cases, in medieval Japan, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and in contemporary Iran, you alluded to protesters' use of different norms, be they cultural or religious or nationalistic, to constrain rulers. To hear a little bit more about that. And then for Gardner, was there an effort to identify similar kind of constraining norms in the cases that you and Jessica have looked at, or could there have been in the cases in China and Central Asia and in Hungary? Thanks.
Do I go first? Just because it's old stuff?
You're always the first.
That's great. Yeah, so for medieval peasants, some of the things that they would often be accused of doing when they were refusing to pay oppressive taxes would be of undermining the financial stability of the temples who would be getting these land rents and taxes. And the temples would typically say something like, this is going to destroy our services for the nation, this is going to be terrible for everyone, we will no longer be able to uphold the balance of society through our religious services, etc., etc. And peasants would typically then use that framing and say, when we are not happy, we will not be able to provide the resources for the deities who uphold society. And so they would, and very, very, like almost to a point, mimic the language, right? So, and they would save many of these documents for generations to come, so that they could use that as a repository of conflict, or repository of protest, right? So they could go back and say, how do we speak to these people, right? And so that's one example from medieval Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Ladies first.
Okay, cool. I have been thinking about this in the terms of audience. So Swords and Bordeaux, both of them talk about audience to be in three different categories. So one are they are neighbors, the other girls who wear white scarves, your comrades in a way. And they are they give you confidence and empowerment. The second one is the messages to the government, where you intentionally undermine their legitimacy, and what your aim is to discredit them, delegitimize them, and actually break the boundaries without breaking the boundaries. So you protect yourself, but you break the boundaries. And I think that's the audience they mainly target. And the third audience that they target are the audiences that spread this. So for example, you know about Women's Life Freedom Movement that happens. It started from a slogan in the Kurdish region, then it moved to Iran, then it moved. So the third audience are the audience to augment the voices, and that's for them is important. So I think when they think about how to navigate that, they actually focus particularly in the second audience, which is the government, and they think about how they can break but not break, but anger them, because they also want some responses from their audience. And then they kind of calculate, or that's how I see it happening. So they calculate about the people who are with you. So the more numbers you have with you gradually, the more boundaries you can break. But they never start from to say, okay, we're going to break all the boundaries. They kind of think about protection and resistance together. And I think that's the distribution of audience that gives them that idea about how to break it.
Well, one example related to the the act of protest while trying to utilize the culture, especially the religious aspect of it. In the Arab Spring, people used the most sacred day in the week for Arabs and Muslims, which is Friday. They labeled their protest with themes associated with Friday. So we have Friday of dignity, Friday of freedom, Friday of this city, because there were protesters that were killed, so showing empathy. And Friday is very highly charged because it sends like kind of a sacred message that this is as sacred, the protest, as Friday itself. This led to an interesting story. One of the most recognized Arab poets nowadays is called Adonis. He is actually in line to get the Nobel Prize for Literature. He has been always in the conversation about getting it. One objection that the Arabs had against him, he's so secular, as many poets are, unless they are Sufis. He said, how come the protest in the Arab world is associated with Friday? He said, this shouldn't be about religion. It should be about, human dignity, human lives. And a lot of people protested that argument because they are saying it's not about the religion. It's actually labeling the human rights that you're talking about to be equal to religion, which is exactly how you should embrace them as a secular intellectual. So he kind of missed the point. That's why a lot of people are every year happy that someone else won the Nobel Prize, saying his argument is really stupid.
I love the question, and I want to say that I think one reason we can all smile when we see the blank page is that we understand as human beings there's kind of a universal grammar of silliness, right? There's an element of humor that is effective in all cases, and it's especially effective when the emperor has no sense of humor. Mm-hmm. Right? So that we all understand what an overreaction looks like. I'd like to also say, as a parent, and for all of those of you who've been parents or who have ever been children, there was a book published by a teacher at my school when I was a kid called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Yeah. We all know that 4- and 5-year-olds know if you're told you can't touch the thing, maybe you can get close to touching the thing, and you will drive your parents crazy. Right? Right? So, humans understand this. This is part of the basic grammar of being human. Right? There's also a history of fools and jesters, talking truth to power accidentally, humorously, in ways that enables them to keep their heads. But then in these particular cases, there are some interesting variations. In the case of Kazakhstan, early in the 20th century, there was a group of Kazakh intellectuals who had traveled widely, learned multiple languages, including Russian, sometimes Turkish, and who wanted for their region some of the freedoms, some of the new ideas that they had seen elsewhere. And I believe this protest harks back to that. I also think, as I said before, that this young man, when he did the protest there, knew that to be effective, it needed to elicit an inappropriate response from the state. Right? So that was part of his protest. It was a performance that needed a second, as well as us watching it. Right? In the case of China, I'm particularly interested to think about a history of Qingyi, of righteous resistance, an old idea usually reserved for elites who knew how to be proper when they were objecting, as opposed to ordinary folks. But I also think about the fact that communist regimes often committed to words like democracy and freedom, even when they didn't deliver them. Right? It's important to note that some of these protesters holding up blank signs when they weren't talking about banana peels and so forth were singing patriotic songs, songs about loving the party, saying, I want to get more COVID tests and so forth. They were doing their, number one, to say they're following the letter of the law. And number two, they're doing it deeply sarcastically and being understood to be so. Right? And remarkably to my thinking, because this very seldom happened in modern Chinese politics, the Communist Party, a month after these protests emerged, scrapped the zero COVID policies. They were extraordinarily effective in that case. Finally, I do want to mention a Soviet joke some of you know that I think is kind of fun here. A man, having waited in line, walks into a shop, sweat on his brow, and he says, let me guess, you don't have any meat. And the person behind the counter says, no, sir, this is a fish shop. It's fish that we don't have here. Right? So there's a tradition of understanding what you can't get. Right? Number two, there is a story about a man who holds up a sign in public in Soviet times with nothing on it, and someone says, I don't understand, what isn't written on there? Why hasn't he written a slogan? And the guy says, oh, I don't need to write anything. Everyone understands what's written here, right? So in each case, I think there are culturally specific contextual clues to how this works that I think is a really interesting response to that question. By the way, I left Hungary to my distinguished colleague because I don't know about it. So.
Okay. Does this work? Yes, it does. Okay. Let's see if I can formulate this well. First of all, I'd like to push back gently on this idea of universal grammar of silliness, because I think that this really only works in a kind of semiotic system where a blank page invites an image or a piece of text, and that's not the case in something like a non-literate system, which have existed and exist still among us humans. Mm-hmm. That's a minor point. But my question is rather, and this is to the entirety of the panel, do you think there is a place for something like irony and humor that is self-reflective in the language of protest? Because some of these protest slogans do seem to take on a kind of air of sacredness, of sacrality, right? And in that sense, they offer a kind of alternative language of what is sacred to what is pushed on the protesters by the authoritarian state. But especially now in our era of meme politics, memes are famously unstable in terms of their semantic content, and they can take on meanings that are directly opposite to what they started out with. And so how do we deal with these shifting and ever-opening boundaries of what is sacred and what's meaningful to us, right?
I think you talk about religion.
I can mention just one example. I don't want to elaborate too. In Syria, there is a famous caricature artist called Ali Farzad. He was critical of the regime by his art. One of the famous pieces that he did, so in Syria, the dictator that was toppled in December 24, who's now in Moscow, he inherited the republic from his father, Hafiz Assad. He became a president just because he is the son of the dictator. Ali Farzad did a funny one. Bashar himself, being in his 40s, he had a son. His son is named Hafiz, like his grandfather. So his caricature has Hafiz, the child, and Bashar. Bashar with a suitcase running because of the Arab Spring. He thought, I just should leave Syria, as Hosni Mubarak and Ben Ali did in Tunisia. His son is holding him. He said, no, that's not fair. You became a president after your father. I should have the same right. So his caricature became so popular in Syria. What happened? He was basically kidnapped. They broke his fingers and threw him on the street. And it was a big story that reinforced the protest movement in Syria.
Would you like to? Okay. So a couple of things. Resistance is always costly. So it's never without cost. Even though we talk about everybody try to minimize the cost, but there's always costly. And you always deal with a lot of terrible, horrible, sad, oppressive news. So humor has a very strong place in resistance movements. First of all, it discredits the oppressor. So you can actually use humor to discredit the oppressor. It kind of gives you a little bit of boost as well, as that, you have to have a sense of humor. I teach international security, and a lot of times it's horrible stuff about this. And I always say, if you want to survive in international security, you should have a sense of humor. So that's the rule for survival. So a lot of times this happens organically as a response. But about the memes, I think that a lot of times they could be potentially dangerous if they're not very well informed. They can misdirect. But at the same time, I think that the movements themselves sometimes correct themselves. And there is a place for mistake as well. I think the main purpose of humor, to me, is to discrediting and to break that huge image that they create, that if you ever come close to us, we devour you. So they kind of, by ridiculing them, you actually undermine the fear that exists. But I just wanted to mention the cost, because I think we talk in a very lovely democratic setting. We all can talk about these things, and I didn't want us to think that it's just without any cost. So yes.
And I'll just add, Dr. Sorinaj has pointed out to me that authoritarian regimes often try not just to control people, but to fix meanings. They want to exclude alternate or challenging interpretations of meaning. One of the interesting things about a blank page is that it doesn't have any specific protest. So even though there's a rumor that everyone knows what's written there, people with very different critiques of the system might feel themselves represented on that sheet, right? So it can be a way of building coalition among multiple dissatisfied groups. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. No opposition movement can ever fix the meanings of its own protest. So it might work to build a coalition. It also might ultimately undermine it, because after all, you haven't said a concrete thing you're for. So I think these are all interesting implications of the semiology of protest and of the attempt to make signs of any sort mean any particular thing for any length of time.
I'd also just very quickly bring in the oppressors into the creation of the sign, because I think all oppressors, all regimes, even the very, very violent ones, think they're doing good. even the Nazis thought they were doing the horrible things for good. It's a warped sense of goodness, but that is sort of what underpins most ideologies, right? And when humor or moral messages speaks to that foundation of goodness, that's where it sort of starts tearing away at the foundation of that regime, right? Because then they suddenly might see themselves, right, as questioning, or they're questioning in their basis. That's what my peasants do, right? They're questioning the whole logic of the goodness on which they rest. So that's something. Up in the back, he's tried several times.
Hi, Ryan McDonald, MA of International Studies. I wanted to ask about euphemism, metaphor, and wordplay, and about its fidelity to truth, right? I think when we say unalive in TikTok speak, or when we say special military operation instead of war, or when we say things like NRPI, no real person involved, we're all straining the language, right? We're trying to avoid censorship or potential incitement. But it is also important that we get to the truth of the matter, right? These people were killed, they were tortured, they were not disappeared, they were taken, and in many cases also killed. So how do we manage the creativity and ingenuity that metaphor can offer while still balancing, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is some of the absolute worst behavior humanity has on offer?
Talk about peasants.
I think it's a tough one, and I think I'm going to revert back to something I mentioned before, right? That this is a very careful navigation or negotiation of what the metaphor can do and what metaphors work, right? And And very often I think you see that it starts somewhere and you're like, okay, yeah, that provoked them too much, right? But there is a limit even, I think, to most regimes, right? And that's what we are seeing with the ridiculous or whatever we will call it, right? Where the regime cannot get itself to murder people for a strand of hair or for a piece of paper or something, right? And that's where it begins, right? And that comes again by I think people trying out, and unfortunately, people at some point meet the other end where they then get killed and disappeared or oppressed in many ways, right? So that's I don't know. That was a non-answer, very academic.
I can give you an example about the bad metaphor. Okay, so when you so there's always a discussion in international security that says, if you tell your people that we're going to go and capture somewhere and kill everybody and get their territories, nobody's going to support you. Even your people are not going to support. So if you go around the world, many of those fighting forces are called defense forces. They're not called offense forces, yes, because who wants to do that? So a lot of times these softening the language, these metaphors they use, it's also have internal usage as well as public usage. So it's not only for the public to not know what you're doing, because sometimes they don't understand the abbreviations, but it's also to kind of manipulate, but also tell the people who are with you and are doing the ordering that you are doing, to say that you're doing a good thing, yes? As Morten said, so that you're doing something moral. And so we soften the language and we actually use it. And it's very powerful and it always works. And that's kind of the basic of propaganda. But what our position is, as scholars, as academics, as students, as people, we should stand to the truth. And that's where you can say, as I have been in one of the meetings that we were talking about collateral damage. That was a very big term 10 years ago, collateral damages. And somebody got up and said, these are the people who are killed. So you need to come on and say, this is the reality of the meaning of this book. And I think part of the responsibilities of academics in the last 50 years, as far as I can see, is that they actually understood that this is one of the positions that they need to constantly stand for the truth. And then Nazi propaganda, they actually understood how effective it could be. And that was, from that moment onward, that's why we always try in academic institutions to protect our independence somehow, because it allows us to stand and say, this is what it really means. And I think we all should do that. But that also requires awareness and education and critical thinking and a lot of different things that often states don't, I mean, they tell you they like it to do, but they don't necessarily put a lot of investment in it. So I think this is one of the civil responsibilities of all of us, to actually talk about these metaphors and expose them.
I think we have time for one quick question.
Thank you, Bovingdon, I'm in your class, but this question is for the two on the left there. We talked a lot about the protest that kind of falls within what is acceptable in these authoritarian regimes, things that they can't necessarily punish you for, and if they do, that's kind of the point. You know, you see this and it's like, oh, obviously that's a censorship of free speech that goes too far. But, and pardon my pessimism, besides the zero COVID idea, is that not letting it happen? Like if we see these blank page protests and we see these like wearing your white scarf instead of something else, you are operating in a system where you're challenging it and like showing people that a lot of people disagree maybe, but in a way that's not subverting what's happening. The law still exists, they're still enforcing these things, and at what point do you go beyond that? At what point is it worth it to then get arrested for not wearing it at all or going against the status quo? Thank you.
Would you like to start?
Sure. So a number of my students from International 100 are here. I'm totally delighted. Last week we talked about civil society organizations and the things they can do within and among states and global civil society organizations and how powerful they can be. One of the implications we didn't talk so much about is their limitations. Sometimes they act like pressure valves. I don't love the metaphor, but they allow people the sense that they are doing something, when in fact what they're doing is merely perpetuating a regime. They're not really attacking it. I just want to echo one thing that Nagar talked about. I think the responsibility of scholars outside these closed and repressive systems is to name things as they truly should be named, interpret them, including when nominally democratic states dissemble and use euphemism. That's a responsibility outside that system, right? That's really, really important. It is not, I think, for us academics, or indeed for journalists, to decide the final answer to Cole's question. It may be that people in the system have decided, I'd rather live to see another day. I can live with this oppressive regime until I see there's enough of a groundswell to overthrow it. Until that time, I'm going to choose small measures, right? So it is interesting and important for us to reflect on this question. And at the same time, we probably are not the people to give the final answer. And I really appreciate it in that spirit.
Computer games, you lose, you play again. You lose, you play again. It actually becomes more and more important to play and beat them. So partly in us, but I think what you suggested was my question as well, is that how they can stop this. And when you ask that question, it should give you the strategy in order to, so that question that you asked is very important because it's the beginning of thinking about how can I strategize to not to continuously doing that for another 20 years. But thank you, very good question.
So, as you can see, we are being oppressed by the clock.
Yes.
So
When it was
it's
flickering,
done.
I was
We are done. But I just wanted to let you bring out sort of an appeal, maybe, that if anyone in the audience and all in the panel want to continue these kind of conversations and free thinking about what constitutes a protest sign, maybe, or something. What is the do some white papers on it, maybe. Please let us know. We are all at IU, and I would love to have the opportunity to continue these kind of discussions. So, but thank you so much for everything.